Saksham, will you be signing us in, or do I start?
We are in, Pavan. Please start.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Saksham, for organizing this. First of all, a warm welcome to all the people attending our seminar. It promises to be a very exciting discussion on migration and the welfare state. We have with us four outstanding researchers, one of whom is an old friend of mine, Dr. Tim Müller. He's a scientist at heart, a brilliant scholar, and he's essentially a quantitative social scientist and a junior research group leader of a project on migration and the welfare state and determinants of resilience towards radicalization in adolescence. In his previous projects, he examined the labor market integration of recent refugees to Germany, and also themes of conflict, mechanisms of secularization and hybrid identities, and biases towards minorities. After studying at the University of Mannheim, he earned his PhD in sociology at the University of Oxford in 2013. That's when Tim and I met, and that's when I had the benefit of being inspired by him and learning from him. He participated as a researcher in studies on the residential segregation of immigrants in Sweden at the University of Linköping and at the Institute of Future Studies in Stockholm, in a collaborative project with the Expert Council of German Foundations for Integration and Migration. He tested a social psychological intervention to increase minority students' academic achievements. A warm welcome to you, Tim. Joining Tim are Hend, Salam, Sean King, and Emily Frank. A short introduction to them. Hend has earned her bachelor degree from the Faculty of Economics in Cairo University. Afterwards, she has obtained her master's from the Faculty of Economics at Leuphana University in Lüneburg, Public Policy and Good Governance program. Right after that, she started her research career at BIM, studying the physical effects of migration in Germany. Then we have Sean King, who has a master's degree in sociology from Freie University Berlin and a bachelor's degree in sociology and philosophy from Trinity College, Dublin. He is also a doctoral student, and thus far has focused on migrant disadvantage and segregation in European labor markets and their institutional determinants. And then we are very pleased to have Emily Frank, who is a research associate at the Berlin Institute for Integration and Migration Research at Humboldt University, as well as a PhD candidate at the Research Training Group, the Dynamics of Demography, Democratic Process, and Public Policy, jointly organized by the Hertie School and the Department of Social Sciences at Humboldt University in Berlin. Emily's research interests also concern migration and the welfare state. A warm welcome to all of you to this seminar. We are very honored to have you, and we are rather looking forward to a great discussion on migration and the welfare state. Let me not keep you waiting. I will turn to Tim, my brother and my friend, to take over. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you so much for this warm welcome. And I always have to say that the inspiration was just on my side, inspiration from Pavan. And thank you so much for giving me and my team the opportunity to present these results, or these partial results, at least, of our current project. I will present them, but it's, as you have heard, my work and the work of all of the members of the project, and Salam, Sean King, Emily Frank. And so each of them has a work package in this project, and I will walk you through these packages and introduce most interesting findings to you. So yeah, our project deals with migration and the welfare state. And the overarching project goal is to identify the conditions for a welfare state system that is well adapted to migration. Because in the current state of affairs, migration is a normal mode of operation in modern societies, but oftentimes social policy making regarded migration more as an exception from the rule. And since there is an increased need to tackle the negative effects of demographic change and population aging, migration is often discussed as a possible solution for this scenario. Then we also expect that there will just generally be more migration in the future, for example, due to reasons like climate change and other factors. And since migration becomes a normal mode of operation of societies, we are asking the question how welfare systems can be prepared to adapt to these increasing migration as a regular state of affairs. However, migration also poses challenges to modern welfare states. It can help to alleviate the demographic burden, but there are some conditions attached to this. If the labor market integration of immigrants is not good or does not work as expected, then this might lead to further fiscal costs. Then, of course, the effects on the economy and the public finances also depend on how skilled or unskilled migration is. Also, the welfare state regulations might affect this skill composition. Then we also have humanitarian migration, which is a challenge on its own. And welfare states are there to serve the needs of all the members of society, and obviously also the people migrating to these societies. So we also have to keep an eye on the functioning of welfare states for everyone involved. So other challenges are the acceptance of migration, because not all populations are accepting of migration. And so we also want to find out about the determinants of acceptance of migration. And lastly, we also want to look into the institutional perspective of welfare state systems, because the way that welfare, migration and integration policy regimes are set up, it creates a certain path dependency. And so different societies have different conditions in which they can adapt to migration. And so all of this together lets us or makes us combine several research perspectives in this project and build an interdisciplinary framework. There are 4 topics of interest, which I want to lay out to you. The first work package will deal, and I am mostly working on this work package, deal with migration models. So everything that we can say, like which we can predict migration, and how, for example, certain institutions in society might affect migration. They might attract migration, or they might lead to out-migration. Then at the same time, we have to take into account selection effects, how different institutions might lead to selection of different groups. Then societies have different ways of regulating migration, which leads to other effects in society, like distributional effects, or like in the way that it also shifts, like the bargaining power within societies for certain occupation groups, let's say. And all of these will affect the fiscal effects that migration has, so positive effects mostly, but in theory also negative effects could happen. And lastly, we also want to look into the acceptance of migration, which will be strongly impacted by the media reporting about migration. That is, people might be true effects of migration, but people might not be able to see the benefits, the fiscal benefits that migration brings, but they will see the media reporting about migration, and that will shape their attitudes, and thus impact the acceptance of migration. So as you can see, these work packages are worked on by Sean King, Hans Salam, and Emily Frank. And so it is also their work that I will be talking about today. I start with the first work package, which is the work package on migration models and the push and pull factors of migration. And the question and some findings that I want to show you are about the question of whether there is welfare gain, or whether the motive is welfare gain or status maintenance in migration, And we apply a particular set of network models to model international migration flows. And in order to give you some context on this question is, well, we want to develop migration models that allow the estimation of scale and composition of migration flows in the future. And in that context, of welfare research, there's a very contentious and maybe not very helpful hypothesis called the welfare magnet hypothesis, which states that generosity might act as a pull factor of immigration. Now, I'm not a big fan of this hypothesis, but it's surely something that we can empirically research. And this debate has been discussed quite strongly with regard to immigrant skill selection effects. And there is a reasoning that usually goes that, well, weak welfare states will allow a high payoff for high skilled because they have a low taxation also, and this will lead to a selection of higher skills into weak welfare state systems. Whereas on the opposite side, the argument goes generous welfare states might lead to a lower payoff for skills and might lead to a selection of lower skilled migration. I, on the other hand, want to bring into discussion a counter argument here, and that is people will not be so much motivated to maximize gains from welfare when migrating, but rather individuals will be motivated, or they don't want to be worse off by moving. They have a status maintenance motive, and they don't want to move into a worse condition for them. So they don't seek to maximize welfare, and I'm trying to show this with the results that I'm now presenting to you. The whole work package is built on the gravity model of migration, standard model to predict migration flows internationally. And previous findings in this framework have shown that we can best predict migration flows between countries through differences in wages or differences in the gross domestic product between origin and destination countries. Also, geographical distance is a very important factor with like moves to very far places are much less likely than local moves, and other migration costs. These are really the main explanatory factors. And in the literature, there is a discussion of whether there are attractive effects of welfare institutions, but clearly this is very mixed evidence. And if these effects are found, they are usually very small. And the biggest effects in migration flows are really based on VP differences. However, there is relatively consistent, there are consistent findings of skill selection effects. What is new in this approach that we will be using here is that it's a network approach of modeling migration flows, and it has certain advantages in comparison to traditional approaches. One of the advantages being that migration flows need not be independent from each other. If migration from one origin to another, to a destination, might not be possible, flows might be rerouted, for example, and so therefore flows are not independent. Also, the way that we model flows allows us to formulate effects that happen in origin countries, effects that happen in destination countries, and difference effects between countries. And this is also important for the argument that I'm trying to make. In this analysis, we looked at migration between 38 mostly OECD countries in 2000 and 2015. We infer the flows based on migrant stocks and origin and destination countries based on the UN migration wallpaper. We construct a network of flows by looking at the proportion of people that moved to a different country in relation to their origin countries. And we control for the distance between countries, the GDP in each country, the population size. We also take into account the existing migrant stock, its percentage of the population, whether there were previous migration flows, and what kind of visa restrictions exist between countries. One or some main explanatory variables of interest are the effects of social expenditures in origin and destination countries. So here we take into account the amount of total social spending, cash benefits, pensions, unemployment spending, family and childcare benefits, as well as incapacity, that is, for example, sick leave benefits. So as I said, there are differences in origin countries, destination countries, and difference effects, and I will now walk you through these results. So first of all, an important finding is, and confirming gravity models of migration, that the GDP in destination countries is one of the most important predictors of predicting the existence of movement flows between countries. When looking at GDP in origin countries, for example, here, we find that there's a slight negative effect. So if you increase prosperity in origin country, people are less likely to leave it. However, it's a much smaller effect than when looking at the attractive effect of total destinations. Second finding is that large countries attract many migration flows, and as already mentioned before, flows are more likely to be to proximate places, not so far away countries. These effects look like they are not significant, but in fact, they are very small but significant. Countries that already have an existing migrant stock will also attract more migration, and is always more migration between, if there was previous migration between two countries, it's very likely that there will also be migration in the future. What doesn't have a strong effect here is migration restrictions, like visa requirements do reduce migration flows between countries, but these are quite small and not significant effects. I will not talk so much about these effects, which are some controls for a network model. However, one interesting observation is that flows are generally reciprocal. So it's not so much that countries receive migration, that's the end of the story. It's more like countries exchange migration. One thing that I still want to highlight is a difference effect for the GDP parameter here, and it's positive. So that means that migration is more likely to happen between, say, poor and rich countries. And this is an indication for the maximization, so that, well, destinations with much higher GDP are sought, basically. Now, when we look at effects of the social spending variables, we first of all find that total social spending, pension spending, cash benefits spending do not have any effects on migration flows. However, there are some very small effects when it comes to unemployment spending, family benefits, and capacity spending. And so, in more detail, we can say that these effects in destination countries, the higher the spending in destination countries, the more likely a flow to that country is. But these are really very small effects in comparison to what we saw with GDP. And my main argument here really is that in comparison to the GDP effects that we saw, the difference parameters of all these spending effects are negative. And so this implies that migration flows are not existing between countries like with very low social spending indicators and very high social spending indicators, which is what we would expect if people would be trying to maximize welfare from social spending, let's say. But in fact, this indicates that migration is more likely between countries with similar spending levels. And I argue that this is an indicator for a status maintenance motive rather than a maximization motive. So people don't want to be worse off by their migration. And let's say you move from, I don't know, a relatively low GDP country, and you can decide move to Germany or the UK, and there is low social spending in the origin country, then it will not matter whether it's Germany or the UK, or the generosity of the welfare state is not important. But if you say move from a country that has generous welfare spending, let's say Germany, then it will matter whether you move to a destination that at least has the same level of welfare spending. And so, yeah, the similarity of these spending limits is, I think, an important fact. Now, moving on to the second work package, which is the work of Sean King about institutional adaptability towards migration. Sean was looking here, or is looking here, migrant segregation in European labor markets and its institutional determinants. And the general goal of this work package is to examine the performance of different migration, integration, and welfare state regimes and their effects on integration outcomes. And the underlying assumption here is that, say, welfare regimes and access to citizenship, for example, are strongly interconnected. And in the same way, welfare and immigration and policy regimes are also codependent on each other. And so therefore, biblical integration policies might follow. There is a very popular classification of welfare state systems, like liberal welfare states, where social rights are based on need, but which have an inclusive citizenship concept. Then conservative welfare state systems, where social rights are based on work, and which have a very exclusionary citizenship concept. And social democratic systems, where social rights are based on citizenship, and they have an inclusive citizenship concept. And so based on this, one would expect that marginalization of immigrants should also be lower in these social democratic welfare systems, but that is not necessarily true, as the findings reveal. Some more background. Europe has had a significant foreign workers for a long time, through guest worker programs, for example, and it is true that migrants are overrepresented in low wage, low skill, long hour occupations, hazardous jobs, with less career prospects, for example, and they are also less represented in labor unions, for example. And there are previous findings that clearly show that institutional and contextual factors in receiving countries together contribute in creating and shaping these dynamics. But the question is, which are these institutional factors exactly? What are the factors that determine migrant disadvantage in these European countries? And the outcome that is being examined here is the extent of migrant disadvantage in 17 European countries, measured as belonging to the lowest national job quartile compared to a national worker, measured on the ISEI scale. This is a logistic regression, first of all, but then the outcomes of this regression, the chances of working in such an occupation, are then further analyzed and try to identify the causal predictors here. And so we are taking into account institutional determinants like welfare state types, like liberal, conservative, social democratic, southern, for example, the size of the low employment sector, an index of employment protection, as well as migration restrictions. And the method that's being used here is a qualitative comparative analysis, which is very suited to determine which combinations of these contextual factors cause high migrant disadvantage. As a first step, in this plot, you can see which are the European countries where there is a high or there are high chance or there's a high extent of migrant disadvantage. And now what you can see is that there is no actual pattern that would say, like, for example, countries that have strong welfare state systems, social democratic welfare states, have low migrant disadvantage, for example. Norway has a very, very strong welfare state, but it's also comparatively high on migrant disadvantage. On the other hand, the UK has a very weak welfare state, but it doesn't show the same levels of migrant disadvantage, for example. So there is no clearly identifiable pattern within welfare state types, for example, but the question is, what institutions do explain this pattern of disadvantage? And I will now in this table only talk about the main outcomes, and basically the result of this analysis shows that there are two causal pathways that explain migrant disadvantage, and these are restrictive immigration policies and the high employment protection, as well as restrictive immigration policies and the developed welfare state system. And so the first causal pathway is represented by these country cases: Spain, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. And the second causal pathway is represented by these cases, for example, Denmark, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. And yeah, the big question is, how do these institutions work together to produce migrant disadvantage? And there is some sketch of a causal path can be made here. First of all, when we look at restrictive immigration regulations, then often the aim of these restrictions is to increase high-skilled work and reduce low-skilled migration. And the way that this is done in European countries is often by use of temporary work permits that are only valid for a certain number of years. And there's a strict monitoring of ongoing eligibility for this work permit. Do people retain their job? Is it still in the same sector that they were assigned to? Were they not using social assistance, and so on? And so all of these restrictions basically shift the power to employers and weaken the bargaining power of low-skilled workers. So that is one explanation. And in combination, these restrictive immigration regulations work in combination with, for example, strong employment protection, which might be, in some countries, unions have a strong power to enforce employment protections, but this creates inside and outside the labor markets and protects insiders in certain occupations. And so the access to these more protected jobs will be limited due to immigration regulations and will lead to a strong informal labor sector. So that is one source of migrant disadvantage, for example. And the second causal pathway is developed welfare state. It's a similar reasoning as above, insider protection, and also a lower unionization of migrant workers. So there is a strong welfare state, but welfare state institutions are not necessarily helping migrants to be less disadvantaged because they are discouraged via strong immigration restrictions to use the welfare state, even if they are in need. And we will hear something more about that in a later work package. Now coming to the package of the fiscal effects of migration, benefits and non-take-up and welfare use in Germany. This is Ken Salam's work package. And it's technically a very advanced analysis, which I have much simplified here. It's a very difficult technical topic, in fact. So the goal of this work package is the development of fiscal models that allow assessing the current and future fiscal balance of migration, taking into account demographic change, the scale and skill composition of migration, the change of migration patterns, for example, with high episodes of return migration, and also changes in the balance of welfare dependency and the contributions that immigrants are making to the welfare state. As a particular topic today, where I will present the results, will be on the topic of non-take-up of benefits, in fact. While most public discussions focus on the take-up rates of social assistance, less is talked about the non-take-up of social assistance. So the question is, do immigrants really take more out of the welfare system than what they put in? And in fact, there might be a very skewed public perception about this because immigrants are contributing a lot to the fiscal balance of states and are also contributing a lot to welfare states, and they don't necessarily take out a lot of the system. The question of non-take-up of benefit is a very important topic, because if we have high rates of non-take-up of social assistance, this can be seen as a failure of the welfare state, which is there in order to guarantee a minimum of existence for its members. And so it would be very inefficient if those that are eligible to benefits would not participate in them. If we look at the literature, then we find that there is a persistent, relatively high level of benefit non-take-up, between 40 and 60%. And yeah, this is a social problem if individuals' needs are not met, although they are eligible. Here we use, or HENT uses a microsimulation approach and uses the rules of the German tax and transfer system are applied to real-world data, income, work status of households, family demographics. Then the theoretical eligibility is determined, and amounts are calculated what the household is eligible to have. And then this is compared with what people say whether they actually receive these benefits, and from that, the non-take-up rate can be calculated. We use a program that's called GetSim. It's the German Taxes and Transfer Simulator, one very new open source framework. The years here are 2017 and 18. Basic income support for the unemployed is what is being simulated. And I'm just jumping right into the results. Basically, what we find is that overall, there is a non-take-up rate of 42% in German eligible households. And the differences between natives, EU citizens, non-EU citizens can be found here. So among native households, native German households, we have a non-take-up 40% roughly, and non-EU citizens are very similar to German households. And for EU citizens, there's an even higher rate of non-take-up. And so if you compare that to households and eligibility, and for example, 38% of non-EU citizen households are eligible, but they have approximately the same levels of non-take-up in German households. And so therefore, actually, migrants are taking not out more of the benefit system, but well, approximately to the same level as German native households, and they are even taking out less out of the system, if you think about it. So we find persistent non-take-up despite eligibility, which is aligning with the previous literature. It's very similar for the non-EU citizens to the German native group, even higher for EU immigrants. Also, this is true when we take into account further individual characteristics. And so if it were true that migrants would significantly overuse welfare benefits, then we should find much lower non-take-up rates for them, but this is not the case. So immigrants are rather receiving less benefits in comparison to their eligibility. And this, of course, also has implications for migrant disadvantage and poverty. And lastly, because I'm already running a bit over time, I want to present some new results from the work package Acceptance of Migration, which are dealing with the media coverage of migrants and welfare and how this affects public attitudes, the work that has been conducted by Emily Frank. So the overarching goal of this work package is to estimate the acceptance of migration while taking into account that immigrants are contributors and receivers of welfare benefits. And there are various factors that might affect acceptance, that is, perceived ethnic competition might play a role, people might be precarious and might see migration as a form of competition. And then people might be affected differently by high versus low skilled immigration or humanitarian migration. All of these are factors that could affect acceptance of migration in different ways. But in these findings that I'm presenting to you now, we are basically interested in the way that media discourses about migration impact people's perception. Because it's very hard for people to form an attitude about complex impacts of migration. They will not know necessarily what the contribution of migration is, but what they will know is what they read in newspapers, for example. So it's an important topic to examine. We work here in the framework of agenda setting. So if there's a lot of discussion about migration-related topics in the media, then this will become a point on the public agenda and will just be generally salient in people's minds. And also what might have an effect is the way that topics are being framed. So a lot of the migration discourse in Germany uses this economic frame, and it also depends on the migrants groups that are being discussed. And one thing that we not now empirically looked at, but which is possibly true, is that a lot of these discussions are rather negatively framed. So the following hypotheses are being tested. The increased reporting about migration or migration and welfare related issues will negatively affect the attitudes about migration. Then attitudes will be negatively affected by actual migration inflows. That would be true if people are reacting to migration as a form of competition. Or the effect might also depend on media exposure. So might impact people that have high and low levels of news consumption. We are in the lucky position to have newspaper data from the past 20 years, German newspaper articles, which have been kindly provided by Professor Blätte from the University of Duisburg. And these are all articles that are migration-related news articles. We further refined them to make them more specific to migration towards Germany, and also looked in how far they contain a welfare-related theme. We also take into account the monthly migration inflow numbers And then we merged this data with attitudes from the European Social Survey. The dependent variable is whether people agree that immigrants are good or bad for a country's economy. We have several control variables here, and we use mixed models to analyze it. Here is a quick overview of the data, basically, of like how often we find in the newspapers that these topics are being discussed since the year 2000 until now. And you see here the monthly migration numbers with the refugee crisis in 2015. And you see that the articles that are related to migration are not necessarily related to the actual migration numbers, but often there are debates about migration and they are not related to increasing migration numbers. And yeah, I cannot really, due to time restrictions, explain all of these different debates, but one can quite clearly identify that there were particular debates about migration, and the question is how they impact people's attitudes. And here are the results. We find that the higher the percentage of migration-related newspaper articles is, this exerts a negative effect on the public perception, a relatively small but significant negative effect. And if additionally a welfare frame is used, the effect is weaker, but it also exerts a negative effect on public attitudes. But in comparison, much bigger effects are exerted by the political orientation of respondents, their education levels, as well as their income levels. So all of these effects together are more important than the media reporting, but it's clear that there is a negative effect of media reporting on attitudes towards migration. However, I should mention that this effect is not found in the time period from 2000 until 2011, where all these effects basically can be explained by the social demographic characteristics. And as a last finding, the effect of media reporting is moderated by newspaper consumption. That is, people that read more newspaper or have a higher news consumption overall than the average, they will be more negatively impacted than people that have less news consumption, or that report less daily news consumption, basically. One should also note that people that have a high news consumption are generally more positive towards migration. But whenever there's a strong reporting about migration-related issues in the media, then this effect becomes slightly negative. And yeah, those was a brief and possibly very fast overview about the results. And I hope that you found them interesting. And I'm now very much looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Müller, for taking us through the presentation. I think this is such a fascinating study, and your set of studies, because I think right from the point of view of methodologies used to the findings that we have, I'm very, very much intrigued, and I think, and thank you for taking us through the work of yourself and your teammates as well. I think off the bat, I think one of the questions that I definitely had was that, as a welfare state, what is the kind of, interventions that it signals, which can invite, say, more migrants more migrants for, within itself. I think what I'm trying to ask is, because when migrants make the decision, they also make it based on the GDP and say that, the expectation of welfare in some sense. Is there any, interventions that, the welfare state should be adopting to signal that, this is the kind of spending that we have, and, and this is the outlook that we have towards migrants?
So let me ask a follow-up on that. So were you thinking of, like, say, countries should make it public that, well, this is how welfare and how the labor market works in our country, just in case you were thinking of migrating first, like in that way?
Well, that's definitely a question, because I think one of the things which the studies also find is about the labor market outcomes, and especially when we link those two things together. When so I was just curious if there's some thinking around that.
Yes, I'm not entirely sure that would work. I'm not sure that prospective migrants would know, like we could try to convey this information. I don't know how much it would really impact people's decision in that way, because there are so many other factors that come into play. For example, having a job offer in the country and so on. So that, of course, everything related to that is very important to convey to prospective migrants. And it would be interesting to see how further information would impact their decision. That's true.
Right. And towards the end, you also mentioned about the impact of media reporting, and I think which is a very, very fascinating subject covered. So I was just curious because, I mean, especially when you talk about, say, the tendency of media reports when they go more negative, people who might be consuming more in news information anyways, their outlook towards migration might also affect. Are there any, could you elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of the methods? I know you had to rush through that, but I think, would be very, very interesting to know more nuances there if you can offer. And especially around, say, what your understanding would be around social media too, because newspapers definitely follow a certain cycle. And I was just curious that social media has been known to also have an impact, if there are any insights to offer there.
Mm-hmm. I will answer this question as far as I can. I am happy to invite Emily Frank to join in, maybe, if she has any further comments on that. But first of all, the methodology was like this. We have a data set that contains media reporting. We were able to analyze the content of this media reporting to a certain extent using particular search strings. And we were able to measure the amount of this kind of reporting in the total reporting of that particular newspaper. And then what we did was we took an opinion survey, which contains information about the attitudes of people's opinions towards migration, and we just relate that with the same time trend. So we don't know whether people in this survey are actually reading that particular newspaper. We just assume that there is a particular opinion climate that kind of, affects their opinion. And to a certain extent it does, at least for the later period that we're studying. But the effects are relatively small. And as per your question about the social media impact, we did not specifically look into that. I would imagine that the impact might be stronger because social media effects generally magnify many opinion effects due to the network structure, the way that that opinion is conveyed in networks and social networks. But it would be very interesting to look into this further. Emily?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I can add that. Yeah, I think it would also be very interesting to look into social media because there is with newspaper reading, there is a selection effect. People choose which newspaper they want to read. Newspapers have their political lean, but with social media, it's even more selective. When you accept cookies in your browser, then they're tracking which information you're interested in. And then you're provided with even more news that leans in your political direction. And then you are even more absorbed in this sort of information bubble. And that can really affect the words that you see in news to describe migrants or to describe welfare. That can really affect the frames that you see around this topic. So yeah, I agree that it would be probably even stronger with social media.
I see that Pavan might have a question to ask as well.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Thanks for a fascinating talk, Tim. One sort of central intuition or message that I'm getting from your findings is that immigrants don't move for charity. That's sort of one of the core things that I'm getting, that charity is not the way to look at it, and that Am I right in, first of all, am I right in understanding that welfare
Absolutely, absolutely. This is not the motivation to move. No.
Exactly. So that's a brilliant finding. I think that's a brilliant finding. The flip side of that, and I would love to see if you have any comments or your team would have any comments, and that is, how does migration contribute to innovation? Because when people come from different cultures, from different parts of the world with different experiences, the potential for cross-fertilization of ideas is increased, right? In much the same way that when a carpenter meets a smith, the likelihood of a new innovation arising is higher than if carpenters were to meet carpenters alone. So how does, do you have any thoughts on how migration might actually increase the surplus in any particular country, how it enriches a country? We've talked about the cost side, but what about the plus side? Any thoughts and comments on that?
Mm-hmm. So based on our own research and data, I cannot say so much about it, but I'm aware of research that has quite convincingly shown that diversity, cultural diversity, is a driver of economic growth. And so that would support your notion of migration as being a very valuable resource to receiving countries. But as you see, and maybe a point there currently, maybe through the developments in the UK, maybe people differ on that, but the UK decided to well, basically restrict their migration very strongly, and generally the effects of this are not very beneficial for the UK. And so, yes, generally, migration is a very positive resource for any receiving country.
Thank you. So then there is a follow-up question. Wouldn't you have thought then that it is completely irrational to then go against migration? And where does this irrationality stem from?
That is very true. And where does it stem from? I guess this ties in a bit with the media effects that we saw. I think it's relatively hard to get an objective view of the impact of migration for the general public. And so whenever there's misinformation, this can be exploited. And B, it's relatively easy to use framing and to, well, portray migration as a way of competition or threat. And I guess that for political decision makers, this is a certain incentive there to exploit this. Also, given the fact that immigrants are not necessarily always well represented, politically well represented in their respective countries.
No, thank you. Very fascinating. Thank you so much, Tim. I'll leave it to others to raise some questions now.
Thanks, Pavan. One of the questions we are getting from the audience as well is the role of remittances within the decision making around migration. So especially in the context of the welfare state, how would you say that remittances factor in the decision to migrate and to continue to stay in that particular country?
This is a question that unfortunately I cannot answer based on the research that we have been doing. Remittances generally have a positive effect on growth in the countries that receive them back, or at least that's what some research overviews have been showing. But I wouldn't know of research that shows how it factors in the decision to migrate. So sorry that I cannot answer that question.
No, absolutely, because I believe that even from an audience point of view, that increasingly remittances have, based on global aid, remittances often compete with that. So, I think that's where it might be coming from, that, how do they factor in with respect to, say, the welfare state taking, a look at the decisions to migrate as well. Now, one of the things I think in the Indian context as well, I'm a little curious to ask if it might be a bit of an extrapolation, because I understand the context of your study, of course, is with OECD economies, but within a context like that of India, where there's a lot of internal migration which we see within various states, because there are a lot of heterogeneous factors which are economic and social in nature. Would you have any comments to offer in that respect on how international migration would differ from, say, domestic migration within a country like India? I think that's something which could be of relevance in future research as well for our audience.
Well, I think in general, the mechanisms are similar. Again, in our research, we don't look so much into domestic migration. However, there is previous research about the internal migration within Germany after the end of the Cold War, after the wall came down. And what had been observed there was that, well, the disadvantage of East Germany at that time, at least, that many highly skilled people left East Germany and moved into the West over the time. And so for some regions in East Germany, this increased disadvantage for those that remained in those regions. And well, generally speaking, the effects that I presented to you with regard to economic differences absolutely also hold for domestic migration. So one thing maybe to add here, what I found also interesting was that, however, the effect of GDP in origin and destination is not symmetrical. So that is, there is a strong effect in destinations, and that would be true for different states within India, I guess. But even if you increase the GDP in origins, it will not have such a strong dampening effect of like persuading people to stay. Of course, it does have an effect, but it would have to be bigger. Speaking from these results.
No, that's very, very interesting in our context to hear too. I think within the context of India, say. The other theme that I think some people from the audience also are interested is the very innovative methods that you have used within the context of your study. We would love to know more, because I did see that you mentioned that there are some mixed methods approaches and qualitative, I think, insights also that you've used. If you or any of your teammates would want to elaborate a bit on that, we are all ears to learn on how the way forward with this particular field of study can also be established.
In that context, maybe, because maybe you're alluding to the findings regarding the causal pathways and institutional effects. Maybe may I ask Sean King to join the debate, because he clearly is an expert on this mixed method design. Sean, can you hear me?
Hello, I can't get my video working right now. But yeah, I'll just say, and also regarding some of the questions about oh, hold on, start my video. Hi. So also regarding questions about which policies can be implemented, one common finding from this literature and also from my own empirical research is that it's not always possible or as simple as plugging in one type of policy in any country, but that a certain type of welfare state or migration policy will be dependent and will always interact with the kind of broader institutional framework that it's set in. So, for instance, in another study on poverty, they found that both a lean welfare state and a very deregulated labor market leads to high amounts of migrant poverty, but also almost the opposite, in that you can have a very strong welfare state, but if migrants aren't given access to it, then that can also lead to high poverty rates. So this kind of idea that different policy fields interact is central to why I chose this qualitative comparative analysis, because it's generally more flexible than standard regression models, and it puts at the center of the analysis this idea of combined causes and interactions between them. I hope that's something.
No, thank you so much, Sean. I think that's a very interesting line of inquiry from a methods point of view. Dr. Müller, and I think your point on the take-up rates of assistance and migrants. I was wondering if in terms of social assistance policies, if what are the kind of insights that particular finding has to offer. We would love to know more from you on that.
Yes, I'm happy to give my own opinion, and of course would be also happy for Hend to join in here. One finding that I find interesting still is the difference with regard to non-take-up rates for EU immigrants, which there might be a different story because EU immigrants also maybe represent, well, temporal migrants or short-term migration, and so maybe there is also not so much a need or to take up benefits when it's only well, some kind of short-term migration. But generally, it's a very valid question which kind of policies we can suggest in order to increase take-up rates, or at least not have a persistent highly non-take-up rates. Hend, would you be willing to share your opinion?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. Actually, it's very interesting because it just touches on the takeaways of the research in the end. So it has been found actually that the amount of the benefit as well as duration have been identified as main factors of the benefits received. So if we are speaking about attempts to increase the take-up of basic income support benefits, then we can discuss the benefits amount, or because in fact, like any migrant group would just weigh the costs or the utility out of the benefits against the costs. And therefore, it could be relevant to increase the benefits amount or to make the process more transparent. Also, to give an example, maybe in the Austrian regime has also made a reform around, I think around in 2010, to increase the transparency of the process and to make it more and easier to access the benefits.
So that's very interesting to hear again, and thank you for offering your insight on that. I know that based on my very limited understanding in the literature on migration, since earlier there was details on lottery based say visa allotments and all those things. I think we have moved on vastly from there, but in terms of one of the themes that your research also touches upon is based on the role of say the skill needs for migrants and the type of employment that they end up generating and also getting. I was wondering if there is any insight that you have to offer for special subgroups of migrants as well, say policies which might be applicable for women migrants, so that especially in the context of the disadvantage that current policies might be placing them at.
I cannot yet say so much about the selection effects in this regard. However, if I may, there is a very interesting finding again in Hend's work here. For example, that women household heads have higher non-take-up rates. Maybe you could say something about this?
Yes, it was a very interesting findings that we found in the analysis that households whose head is a female are less likely to take up the benefits. So they are more likely in comparison to their male counterparts to take up, so they are less likely, yes, to take up the benefit. which is an interesting finding, and it just sheds a light on the poverty of the female households.
I'm just curious if you have any insights to offer on why that might be, or the pathway of that, or it might just be too early to comment on that. But just wondering if you have any insights to offer there.
Maybe I can tell just from my own experience, women are usually busy and have their households, children, and taking care of many responsibilities. Therefore, especially in a migrant country, they will be even more and more engaged and busy with their daily life. So I think making the process easier in general would just enhance the access of such female households to the benefits, and making it also more transparent, and they let them get informed about it in the media debates or public policy is also a very relevant point. But that's my own opinion.
Right. No, thank you for opining on that. So
I'd have a short follow-up on this.
Please.
That's okay. Yeah, so just on the issue of specific policies targeted towards women, they could definitely work. I don't have an exact one, but one example, and related to what Hen was saying, of an industry that's very gender split would be care work. And across Western Europe, we've seen that, so as there's been increasing women go into the workforce, a lot of care work has been outsourced to migrant labor. And over time in European countries, it's changed from being more state-provided care to more cash-for-care systems. So households are given money to spend on some sort of care work, and this often leads to bad working conditions of sometimes live-in migrants. And in some instances, there's even like exceptions for care work from general labor law. So one, I don't know if you could call it a policy intervention, but just give care workers like full rights to the labor laws that everyone else has, and also just increase enforcement of existing laws.
But thanks again for offering that insight. I think there's so many questions that I have to ask, and I'm also a little cognizant of the time. But perhaps I think Dr. Müller, towards the later part of your study, you also spoke about media and and the kind of impact that it has on the outlook towards migration. I was wondering if you might want to talk about some interventions, or even some policy interventions in tackling say these kind of say reporting or even fake news perhaps, and its implications for designing policies in the future. I think our audience is also interested on the topic of fake news, and we know that you also consider political leanings of the newspaper, and you already have commented on that. But if there are any more insights that you have to offer there, we would love to hear on that aspect too.
Yeah, well, this is a question that is, again, very much related to the social media question. I mean, one thing that plays a role, and I think Emily also might support this interpretation, is that education plays an important role. That is usually more politically informed persons will have more positive, or maybe also more realistic views on migration. So that is one thing. We can always invest more into political education, the general political information, and B, how exactly you tackle fake news. I'm not sure there is. I mean, I'm sure there are some technical fixes, but maybe you should take away the incentive for policymakers or politicians to mobilize along these lines at all. Because it is maybe too easy in electoral competition to go on about this topic. It's of course a topic of public interest that needs to be discussed, but maybe the discussion needs to be more balanced. But Emily, I would be happy to have you join in here.
Yeah. Yeah, the finding policy solutions was beyond the scope of our research, but there are a few possibilities. So like I was mentioning before with cookies that track your preferences and your interests on the web. There could be some regulations regarding cookies. Also, the percentage of reporters who are actually from minority groups is way lower than the proportion of readers in the population who are from minority groups. So increasing equality in the journalism field could maybe help a little bit.
Right. No, that's, I mean, I thanks for even opining on that. I know some of these might be beyond the scope, and we very much appreciate you also offering your insight there, especially because I think recent literature within economics, like work by Darren Acemoglu and co-authors, I think around homophily and in-group out-group biases and within spread of misinformation. I think those are some very, very interesting insights that your own research also perhaps speaks to there. So I think very, very cognizant of time, and I know that we are already 5 to 6 minutes over time. But I would really like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Müller and Emily, Sean, and for taking the time to be here and for accepting our invite. And we definitely are going away from this webinar a little bit more richer in terms of our understanding of migration, especially in the context of OECD countries, and I'm sure that some insights that we have to offer within the Indian context too. So thank you very much again for taking the time, and we hope that we get an opportunity to invite you again.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for a great talk, Tim and team. I mean, this has been absolutely wonderful, and it reinforces my belief in humanity, that migration is actually good for society. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. It was a great pleasure for us.
Thank you. Thanks, CSBC team, for putting this wonderful discussion together. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye.